We're going to hear a pre-recorded talk from Kat Dawson, who, as Marie just said, will then join us for discussion afterwards. So Kat's research investigates the social construction of subjectivity through queer, feminist, and anti-racist representational strategies in postmodern and contemporary American culture. Their current book, Monumental Futures, investigates the conditions of memorialization in and beyond colonial representational economies by indexing responses by Black, Indigenous, and queer artists to the afterlives and effects of settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. A subsequent book, Queer Photography and Its Metaphors, queries the emergence of queer and trans representational strategies and investigates the profound impact those strategies have had both within and beyond the medium of photography. They've taught courses on the study of women and gender and the history of art at Smith College and the University at Buffalo, and have peer-reviewed articles forthcoming in Art and the Public Sphere Journal and Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture. They hold a BA in the study of women and gender from Smith College and a PhD in visual studies from the University at Buffalo. They're a member of the College Art Association and the National Women's Studies Association.
Hey folks, my name is Kat Dawson. My pronouns are they, them. I'm currently a Mellon Fellow at UMass Amherst and a lecturer at Smith College, both in the history of art. Before I begin, I want to thank Maria Murphy at the Center for Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies for all the work that went into putting this together, as well as her colleagues in gender, sexuality, and women's studies, and the faculty sponsors here at Penn. Of course, I'm excited to listen to and learn from my fellow presenters, but I want to extend an apology for not being there in person, not only because I was there on a fellowship last year and would love to see some of you again in person, but also simply to miss the opportunity to meet many of you. By way of explanation, if not quite an excuse, my first book is due on Tuesday, and I simply ran out of time to make this trip. So I work at the intersection of the history of art and gender and sexuality studies, and I was invited to give a talk today on trans pedagogy in my field. And one of the really exciting things about my field, which may or may not be shared by others, is that there is an extent to which we still have not figured out precisely what crucial components of trans approaches to our field could be, such as what a trans art historical method might be, or how and under what circumstances transness becomes visible in the context of fine art. One of the questions that arise from this, again, as might be more or less the case in other fields, but which has consistently attended the work of those of us at the cutting methodological edge of most fields, is how to teach what we are ourselves just learning. My primary focus at present is undergraduate teaching at a small liberal arts college, which has some characteristics that might make sense to lay out before I launch into a discussion of what I do in the classroom. My classrooms have between 12 and 24 students in them. I run multimodal spaces that center student discussion, and I position myself as a discussion facilitator more than an expert. About half of my classes have titles like queer and trans visual cultures that tend to get students who self-select for those materials and methods, and who might only come secondarily for the art historical material. The other half of my classes are the other way around. And so students might come for art history, but get a class in which discussions about minoritized subjectivity and representation are considerably more foregrounded than students might expect. But regardless of what class I'm teaching, I foreground the close reading and object-based analysis of art history. And one central pillar of the field of art history, at least insofar as I understand it at this point, is that through careful study of an object, by situating its form, narrative, and materials in the social and historical context in which the work of art is viewed, installed, or seen, we can come to know something more or less true about that object. And indeed, if we take a historiographic approach to most major objects of art historical study, we can see a gradual evolution of deepening knowledge about the object that tracks or uncovers historical and archival revelations related to the object and its time. But as is the case for many fields, ultimately, we rely on disciplining as a precondition of any line of argumentation. And so one of the things that trans studies can do for us, maybe for any field, is to uncover binary scaffolding, undergirding certain assumptions or arguments, whether made by a student in the classroom or a scholar in an assigned reading. Generally speaking, there's much that trans studies can do for art history. And I'll take a moment to express gratitude and respect for Che Gossett, who last year co-edited with David Getze a syllabus for trans and non-binary art history, which is both an incredibly great engaging resource and also a testament, as they say in their introduction, to just how little there really is in the field. So I hope it functions, among other things, as a call to incite more TGNC scholarship in the field, both within and beyond their syllabus. It's evident that actively and intentionally bringing more trans voices into art historical discussion in the classroom is a going concern. Some exciting projects have emerged in the last few years, but the process of finding more scholarship and art to put on syllabi and slide decks to deepen conversations around trans lives and representation in our field is a challenge faced by many fields. And it's the case not just for trans subjects, but other minoritized subjects and histories as well. So with an eye to the fact that some of those things are shared across disciplines, I want to focus my remarks today on 3 key areas, some of which might be familiar to some or all of you. The first regards an exercise that I do in my class. The second, trans pedagogy for object-based analysis in art history and other object-based learning fields. And finally, some closing remarks about the stakes of this work. So I come to my pedagogy in some ways through trans affirming practices, but this is not specific to teaching trans studies. This is likely something others do, perhaps likely better, but it's worth mentioning because it has to do with normalizing self-identification and ownership over disclosure in the classroom. It's a getting to know you survey that I circulated at the beginning of the year called the Getting to Know You Survey. I welcome, by the way, suggestions for alternative titles. It's hosted in Google Forms, it's anonymous, and it invites students at the beginning of the year to tell me about themselves, their interests and majors, their aspirations for this class, et cetera, and so forth. And these things may or may not end up factoring into the actual content of the course, but it helps me get to know them a little bit and helps build, I think, the trust that makes rich generative classroom discussion possible. It also asks students to share with me the name they want to be called in the class, indexed to their student ID number rather than the name which they are registered under in the system. And finally, of course, what pronouns they like to be addressed by. It's an imperfect system, and some schools like Smith, where I currently teach, allow students to change names, hide dead names, or state pronouns in the system, but not all students use it and not all schools have it. And I generally find that while some students simply won't use it, for at least one student each semester, it's incredibly meaningful to have the opportunity. And for me, that constitutes reason enough to do something. This other part of it isn't specific to trans experience, but I think it is highly relevant nonetheless. I also make really clear at the beginning of the semester and in my syllabus, but actively solicit within this survey, that we all have different ways of being in the world, different ebbs and flows of energy and focus, different relationships to identity and embodiment and disability, and that students should take time, pace themselves, let me know if and as I can support or better make space for them. And I invite in these surveys, in remarks in class, on my syllabus, for students to self-disclose in any way that makes sense to them. It is an active practice for acknowledging, affirming, and making space for disability in ways that critically focus on the student's self-understanding and not institutional diagnoses and permission structures. And you can hear within these the ways in which such invitations align with trans embodiment and experience. At any rate, that concludes my first brief section. This next section is based on object-based learning, which is not unique to art history, but which is if not the central focus of discipline, again, insofar as I understand it. Object-based learning and the close reading of images is kind of our whole thing. What follows here is a combination, explication, and performance of trans pedagogy in the history of art. Art historical method invites us to begin on the surface of the work, and so that's where I will also begin today. The object I want to study together is a black and white film still of what looks like a busy urban sidewalk. And this is the kind of image that I would put up on the board and ask students to read together as a class, but in the interest of time, I'll read it myself. In the center of the frame is a person with short curly hair, round reflective glasses, and a mustache in a black turtleneck and patterned pullover. Though their mustache obscures most of their mouth, their lower lip is visible below it, as though they are just in the middle of a word. The subject draws the attention from others within the frame, in particular the adult on the left side of the frame, seems to be looking askance at this figure, or maybe the person is just looking behind them. While on the right-hand side, a child in glasses looks up at the figure, and something in their proximity of their bodies, the figure's parted lips, the child's attentive gaze, might suggest they're in conversation or somehow in relation to one another. In class, as we describe this image, it often quickly emerges that students, quote, can't really tell what the central figure's gender is or what their race is. Those indeterminacies are always, almost without exception, articulated by at least one student in the classroom through a binary. For example, I can't tell if the person is a man or a woman. But even when they aren't articulated in such binary terms, the classroom discussion that emerges around this image or around an image like it that similarly provides students with multiple moments to latch on to about gender and its co-constitutive identity positions, but offers no easy answer as to which ones are correct insofar as that exists, tends to evidence that both that bodies are disciplined by gender and that this disciplining happens in conversation with intersectional subjectivities, in this case, particularly that subject's race. This is a still from the multimedia series of works titled Mythic Being by the artist and philosopher Adrian Piper, who identified as a light-skinned Black woman until she, quote, retired from being Black in 2012. She does not, to my knowledge, identify as anything other than cis. And this particular image, Piper's male-gendered alter ego, named Mythic Being, is being recorded by a film crew as he walks down a crowded New York City street. Piper is diminutive of height and slight of frame, so she doesn't take up a lot of space in the world except when she wants to, as she periodically does throughout the Mythic Being performances. But this particular, misspoke. She periodically means to take up space in a number of her performance works, but Mythic Being does not fall into that category. Indeed, with the exception of this particular excursion in which she's accompanied by a film crew, the Mythic Being seems to move through the world distinctly unremarked upon among the many projects in Piper's oeuvre. One of the things that makes Mythic Being such a good teaching tool is that there's a significant body of scholarship on the work that dates back to the 70s. And since then, art critics have been working on this, and low-key plug, as I show in a forthcoming article, tend to make one of two arguments, both of which rely on a reading of this figure as one of two binary genders. In the first, the central figure in the work is understood as definitely a woman who could not possibly pass for male and makes that obvious through how bad her drag is. And at the same time, that her inability to pass as male enables her to pass racially, as though one can only pass in so many ways at once. In the second interpretative line, the Mythic Being is read as, quote, unavoidably Black and male, unquote. Assertions that this is a male figure tend to be presented alongside images from the series taken out of context to suggest an aggression that is easily mapped onto or through stereotypes about Black masculinity, while ones of the Mythic Being doing yoga or being ignored while smoking a cigarette in the middle of Harvard Square are left out of publication or discussion. After the class reads the initial image as a group, I break them into groups based on the assumptions that they made about the figure, and I give them excerpts from key scholarly works that argue a position that departs from theirs. The resulting assignment is for them to read the essay, distill the author's argument, use their understanding of the work to critique the essay, and then offer their own analysis and interpretation of the work based on what they just read and dissected. That this isn't a legibly trans work of art is helpful here, I think. Legacy Russell talks about donning gender, quote, as prosthesis, unquote, as an extension of the self sometimes, but not always a vital one, but one that is always already external to the self. And somehow the Mythic Being's gender gives form to the prosthetic nature of gender overall. Maybe it's that Piper imagined the work as, to quote her, being in drag, dressed as a boy, unquote, with the word boy capitalized and italicized. And I think this is what gets students interested in what makes the work possible to talk about denaturalizing gender binaries with. The process of denaturalizing the binary is also helpful to understanding the work of art in its historically specific terms. In the case of Mythic Being, for example, a trans methodological approach to undisciplining this body makes it possible to see mythic being as a work about the co-constitutive nature of race, gender, and other markers of subjectivity, particularly but not exclusively related to minoritization, about how meaning is made relationally, and about what conversations around those themes were happening and are brought to the center here in 1973. This is just one example of trans pedagogy and object-based analysis. An exercise like this lays bare the groundwork for students to actively question how certain assumptions become attached to an image just in the course of looking at it. It gives an entree into discussing trans identities, the multiplicities and complexities of gender, but also does so in a way that is in conversation with the ways in which bodies are racialized, offering multiple thematic toeholds for students with different interests to get a hold of. It builds confidence in the and capacity around description and engagement with, in this case, the critical or scholarly essay, where students can see how institutionally sanctioned knowledge can be scaffolded by a set of assumptions about gender, not only with which they might not agree, but also, and which is where I try to get by the end of the class, which rely on the regulatory system rather than an acknowledgement of the ability to move or exist between binaries or beyond those systems. And that leads me to my third section, which is about stakes. The stakes in the classroom for this are pretty cool in my experience. I introduce art by and or of trans subjects, which also has huge payoffs for students particularly engaged with those subjects and questions. But this exercise makes those conversations easier. An exercise like this can also feel low stakes to some students and high stakes to others, but can build confidence for all through a range of skills and talking about a range of subjectivities. An exercise like this also gets them to question how they describe things, what terms they use, why and under what circumstances they need to qualify certain bodies. The habituated practice, for example, of naming non-white races, non-cisgenders, visibly disabled bodies, and so on. And whether and when it might make sense to do those practices, augment them, or perhaps stop them overall. One thing that trans pedagogies can do for object-based analysis then is to understand, is to undiscipline how we look at images, question underlying assumptions, and imagine how an argument might be otherwise if the assumptions were too. Thus, trans pedagogy can help students learn these things in action, in practice. But there, for me, kind of is a higher set of stakes for this practice that includes but is not limited to trans studies. And I kind of got to that just now, and hear me out on this last one. Learning to see in a way that normalizes or centers undisciplining is central to trans pedagogy, but it's radical praxis. To undiscipline how we categorize what we see is, which I think is a key promise of trans studies in general, but trans pedagogy, if we're doing it right in particular, is to help students look in a way that invites a shift in perspective. I'm reminded of Dr. Nicole Fleetwood's work on the impact of incarceration on contemporary visual art. Fleetwood's work stems from and is in conversation with racial justice and prison abolition and is not trans method or pedagogy at all, at least not so far as I understand her work or either of those terms. But why I think of her work when I think of the stakes is that our role as teachers is to support students in becoming able to see the world in ways that make new things possible. The majority of our students won't go into our disciplines. And so we're supporting the development within them of critical interpretative skills that enable them to see, to use Dr. Fleetwood's work as an example, art made in prisons, not as art made by prisoners, but rather the work of artists held in punitive captivity. To help students see in the ways that trans pedagogy, among or in conversation with other minoritized or radical pedagogies, makes it possible to understand that artists are imprisoned, to shift how we value lives on a very basic level, in other words, that's not specific to trans studies, but which certainly touches trans lives. I know that this might feel like a reach, but in essence, what I'm just trying to get at is that the most important work that trans pedagogy can do is to offer students the tools to go to the root to learn its contours and to see what else it might be connected to, what binary gender might be locking down, and therefore to begin to ask what else might be possible if those forms are no longer all there is. Thanks very much.